Hey there, welcome back to the show. This is Phil. I'm here with Skye Jitani.
Hi, Phil.
Hi, Skye. And we have a guest. Christian's not here. Christian was going to be here. She has some sort of upper respiratory...
Yeah, I got the text this morning.
Yeah, something. She has something. She has a thing.
She's verklempt.
She's verklempt. That means you're like tearful.
Well, yeah, but you get choked up.
She's choked up.
Yeah.
Christian can't be here because she's choked up. I forgot our ad. I have to do our ad.
Yes, you do.
Okay. The Phil Vischer Podcast is brought to you by you, listeners and viewers that support us on Patreon at patreon.com so we can pay our director, Jason, and our unpaid intern, Sean. And so we can bring in guests. We can fly from miles and miles away to set up on Skype. Like our guests say, our guest today is John Inazu. Right? Was that right? Did I say it right? Okay. John D. Inazu is Associate Professor of Law and Political Science at Washington University in St. Louis and a visiting fellow at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Culture at the University of Virginia. Can women be visiting fellows?
Absolutely.
Okay. And they still call them fellows?
I think it's, gender neutral.
Oh. How do you like that? Fellow is gender neutral.
Yeah, like a fellow traveler.
Or a fellowship.
Yeah.
Oh, fellowship.
Yeah.
Is that you have a fellowship? Is that what that means, to be a fellow?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
Or it's a fella.
There's no such thing as a gal ship. But all ships are female.
Yes, they are.
If there's anything we learned from war movies, she's going down.
You don't want to really go into the psychology of that, do you? Freud had a lot to say about it.
Why did you write a paper about it?
No, but I had to read a lot about Freud's view of archetypes when I was an undergrad.
Really?
Yeah, because we used to take his analysis and use it to describe religious mythology.
Okay.
Freud had a lot to say about religion.
Yeah, he did.
So anyway,
Yeah.
any kind of vessel that contains anything is feminine. And so there's,
Okay. So what's masculine then?
You don't want to know.
States? Okay. Never mind.
It's Freud. That's why I said you don't want to know.
I don't really want to know what Freud thinks about feminine and masculine. Okay. Theme song. Isn't there a theme song for this show?
Unfortunately.
Hey, it's a podcast. What do you know? Hey, it's a podcast. And we got video. Hey, it's a podcast. So lend an ear. The Phil Vischer Podcast starts right here. Oh, we'll talk to Skye.
Hi, Phil.
Hi, Skye. But Christian's not well, so we brought in John Inazu, as you can tell. Thank you if you're looking at our Zoom feed. It's actually not Skype, it's Zoom, because Skype we found a little unreliable. Hey, it's a podcast, so lend an ear. The Phil Vischer Podcast starts right here. The Phil Vischer Podcast starts right here. One of these days, I'm gonna just smash the ukulele at the end. Of
you're gonna go. You're gonna go Animal House on it.
Yeah.
That's what I've been waiting for.
Fire, like Jimi Hendrix. But fortunately, ukuleles are relatively cheap, so I could come back the next week with a new one.
Yes, you probably could.
So it might not be the answer to your prayers.
Well,
if I did that,
it would be temporarily.
For the rest of that episode.
Yes.
Anyway.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. We got a couple of stories before we get into John and his book. Donald Trump, a born-again Christian? Did you hear about this?
Is there a question mark on the end of your statement?
Yeah, there is, because there's actually a question mark on this headline. Has Donald J. Trump become a born-again Christian? That is the suggestion of who? Who do you think would suggest that?
I think I know.
Dr. James Dobson.
Yes, that's who I heard.
Because he wrote a book about the strong-willed child. And if there's one way to describe Donald Trump,
it's a strong-willed child.
It's a strong-willed child. This is the suggestion of James C. Dobson.
To be honest, I didn't even know James Dobson was doing anything public anymore.
I know. He's in his 80s. It's kind of time to hang it up. But, he did
hang it up.
Robertson.
He retired. He left Focus on the Family.
No, not exactly.
Well,
he started a new ministry.
I thought, but is he on the radio anymore?
Yeah, he has a new radio show. I
don't keep up with.
He wasn't thrilled about how things ended. And so he started again and actually is at it again.
Okay, well.
Yeah. And I've found that people tend to only get more thoughtful when they're nearing 90 and they've been on the radio all their lives. If there's anything I learned from Pat Robertson, it's that people only get more thoughtful. What will I be like when I'm nearing 90 if I'm still doing this?
That's a good question. Although you could be, because you have very long genes in your family.
I have long genes, Mr. Long Genes from Captain Kangaroo.
Yeah.
Okay. But back to the story. James Dobson says, and he said this during the big evangelical meeting, last week in New York.
Yeah, with 1,000
evangelicals. Were you there, John Inazu?
I didn't get the invite.
You didn't get the invitation? Okay. Skye, were you there?
I was not, surprisingly.
Huh, that's funny. So Dr. Dobson said he knew the person who had led Mr. Trump to Christ, or Mr. Christ to Trump, which may be how it has to work.
Right. You come to see me.
Yeah, I don't come to see you. You come up the escalator. Though he did not name him. I don't know when it was, but it has not been long, Dr. Dobson said. I believe he really made a commitment, but he's a baby Christian.
With baby hands.
Donald Trump is a baby Christian.
So wait a minute, though.
Okay, yeah?
Because... how do I say this without just going over the top? Donald Trump strikes me as the kind of salesman, the kind of business guy who will do anything to close a deal.
No.
I think
Are we talking about the same?
I think so. He's the type that he kind of reads a crowd or reads an individual, figures out what they want to hear, and then tells them what they want to hear. So I'm sure if he was in some kind of important meeting
Wait a minute. So you're saying, that Donald Trump, if he's courting the evangelical vote and he's having 1,000 evangelicals come to his hotel, might spin his personal beliefs
he is
to garner their support?
He has perfected the art of the pander.
And the deal.
Which I think is the pander in his case.
Okay.
So whether or not this story is genuine or not, I think rather than some hearsay argument about, I think Donald Trump accepted Christ, blah, 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 blah. I heard from a guy who said a thing about this time. It might be better to actually look at his fruit.
What do you call it when you can pander very quickly?
A fast pander?
Pander Express. Thank you very much. Okay, here's the part of the story that got me.
Okay.
Though, because Dr. Dobson has some misgivings about Mr. Trump. He said, in his interview, Dr. Dobson conceded that Mr. Trump did not exactly fit the typical mold of an evangelical.
The typical mold?
The typical mold,
What is the typical mold?
And it came from their meeting. So the problem that Dr. Dobson had with Mr. Trump that may not quite fit we expect from an evangelical.
Is it the owning of casinos? Is it the cover on Playboy magazine and hanging out with porn actresses? Is it the multiple marriages or talking about how hot his daughter is? Which part of it is?
During the meeting, he used the word hell 4 or 5 times.
Oh, well, clearly he is not saved.
Dobson said he doesn't know our language. He added that Mr. Trump, quote, refers a lot to religion and not much to faith and belief.
Well, okay, let's reverse this a little bit. Does that mean that if somebody uses the right language,
then they're evangelical?
They're in. That's it.
Because he speaks our language. He doesn't know our language, but he could learn it. I mean, you can learn to say the right words, right?
I've been trying that all my life.
I'm a little concerned that this is how we as evangelicals are coming across.
Just now you're concerned? You think this is...
that, okay, we think he's maybe one of us. Okay, the torture, no, we can deal with that. The saying we should kill the wives and children of terrorists. Okay, Jesus could probably get on board with that if we were in enough danger. But if he swears...
And I mean, is hell really still considered a swear?
Hell yeah.
Because I think that's borderline. That's not even borderline.
Let's ask a legal expert. John?
Yes.
It's not one of the 7 words forbidden by the FCC.
It's not. No, it's not. You can say hell on TV.
Yeah.
Yeah, but good Christians. Did you grow up in a strong Christian household?
Well, we could say hell.
You could say hell?
So he's not an evangelical.
Okay. Well, that's
Problematic.
and probably drink heavily at the age of 5.
I can't talk about that.
Do you or your family own any casinos?
No casinos.
Okay.
Okay.
Had to think about it.
Okay. So I'm a little concerned that, well, for one thing, there's so much interest in saying he's one of us. And for another thing, even the things that concern us seem to be completely backwards.
Well, this is what I don't have any clarity about from these platformed Christian leaders, whether Franklin Graham or Dobson or whoever. What are they really concerned about? Is it more important that a candidate be an evangelical, or is it more important that a candidate actually advocate for values and policies consistent with the evangelical view?
Yeah.
Because they seem to be going back and forth with Trump. Some are very concerned that he's one of them, but they don't seem as concerned that his ideas are completely contrary to faith.
Right.
Others are saying, well, it doesn't really matter that he's not one of us because he's advocating for a Supreme Court justice who's pro-life and religious liberty and getting rid of Muslims. And so they go, oh, okay, that's fine then. But when it comes to like another candidate like Obama, they don't care if he's an outspoken Christian because they don't like his policies. And then there's others who go, no, he's actually a closeted Muslim. So just make up your mind. What do you care more about, identity or policy? And I think Trump fails on both fronts.
Except he says he's going to nominate whatever Supreme Court justices we ask him to nominate. Is that our price? Is that?
But see, there's the pander again.
Yeah.
There's no, how do you trust a panderer?
Yeah. Too much orange chicken. Okay, next story, and this one John needs to jump in on. California, a new bill. Biola University might be in trouble. Have you heard about this, John?
I have. This is a big deal.
It's a big deal. Okay, so
What's going on?
During Obergefell, you know Obergefell?
Is that a new restaurant? They're popping up everywhere.
The Obergefell versus Hodges case, which was the same-sex marriage case, Justice Alito made a comment in that case that if the Obama administration's contention was that traditional marriage laws were analogous to racial segregation, wouldn't schools that defined marriage traditionally be in the same category, such as those like Bob Jones University in the 1990s, who continued to enforce anti-segregation campus policies and thus became ineligible for tax-exempt status?
Right. So going back, Bob Jones University used to have a policy that forbid interracial dating.
Yes, among other things.
And as a result, they were going to lose their tax-exempt status.
Is that correct, John? You know the.
That's about it. Yeah, in the 80s this happened.
Right.
Yeah.
And then eventually dropped that policy.
Right. And now there is the state legislature in California is seeking to amend a non-discrimination law, which would stipulate that the only schools that can be granted religious exemptions to the non-discrimination statutes are schools that exist for the training of pastors and theological educators.
So seminaries, essentially.
Yes, basically seminaries can be exempt. Schools that offer more general programs like a degree in the humanities or engineering or public education would be required to submit to the non-discrimination law, effectively ending, and this is Samuel James writing for the ERLC, the CERL, the Russell Moore's organization.
Yeah.
What is it? The Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission of the Southern Baptist Convention.
Jinx.
The Erks Clunks. So other schools like Biola, for example, would be required to submit to the non-discrimination law, effectively ending any legal protection for colleges and universities that want to only admit professing Christians or maintain campus-wide spiritual life programs.
Well, this seems a little odd because there are a lot of schools out there like Biola or other CCCU schools that ask their students to sign a statement of faith.
Yeah.
Basically saying you need to be committed to these doctrines of Christian faith to be a student here.
Right.
So what are they saying? You can't include anything in that statement of faith that has to do with sexual behavior?
That's what the result of this would be, yes.
John, doesn't that strike you as odd?
That's the end game of this. That's right. Yeah. And I think Christians are often a little quick to cry wolf over some of these issues, but this is one that's worth crying about. I mean, this is a serious issue that is going to be tough to stop given the state of the law in California. And you're right, it's targeting these schools pretty explicitly for that reason. And the other sort of pernicious thing it's doing is saying that the seminary definition basically means you only count as religious if everything you do is explicitly theological, which sort of discounts a lot of what Christians do in the world.
Yeah, and I was reading some of the comments. That's always a mistake.
Don't do it.
Reading the comments. But people were arguing back and forth. And the big argument for was if the majority of Californians think it's wrong to discriminate for sexual orientation, then California should have the right to withhold funding or whatever status they're granting as a privilege. It's a privilege. Mm-hmm. You didn't earn it. It's a privilege. So the state should have a right to withhold that privilege or that funding if you don't agree with basically the point of view of the majority.
Well, couldn't you, this is a hypothetical, but couldn't you poll the people of California and find that, let's just pretend, a majority of them do not believe in the Trinity, and therefore any school that has belief in the Trinity as a requirement for admission should not get funded.
But is there a group of people that are non-Trinitarian as a protected class?
Well, that's the point, is we have made sexual identity a protected class over against those who have religious beliefs about sexuality are no longer considered a protected class.
Yeah.
I mean, we all knew these arguments and fights were coming, but is this the first one that could actually set a precedent in the court?
John, help us out. What do we do?
Well, the bad news is we already have these precedents in the court, especially the courts that control California. So it's a little bit of a too little too late. And the real issue is not so much that that sexual identity or orientation is a protected class. It's that this kind of law would apply equally to any school and would not single out religion. So your Trinitarian example actually wouldn't work because that would be a religious specific kind of law. That kind of law still does have protections. The problem here is these laws are all couched as general laws applicable to all schools, religious or non-religious, and that's how it's going to steamroll the efforts here.
But can't you make the argument that for an awful lot of people, marriage and sexuality is a part of religion, even though there are people outside of religious belief who also obviously have a sexual identity in marriages?
Well, yeah, that's certainly right. But the problem is the way the law works now, if the law targets a general class of beliefs that are not just religious, and this would be one of those cases, there aren't going to be good protections for it. Now, that's not necessarily how the law should be. It just happens to be how the law is, which is why the California schools are in a lot of trouble.
So, who's that? Is that you, Phil?
Hang on, sorry.
He's got a phone call.
That's my wife trying to get through. Sorry. I feel terrible. I had to hang up on my wife to save the show. It was for the show, Skye.
It was to avoid an edit.
We'd never edit. There's no editing.
I know.
There's no turning back. We only press on forward. I don't know what.
So, John, eventually do these cases just make their way up to the Supreme Court again before we get a definitive answer on how this is going to play out?
Well, it depends. I mean, so there's a good chance this won't ever get to the Supreme Court. It will just be upheld in the jurisdiction of California, which will be bad news for the California schools. So that's part of it. And the other thing is you might see the effects of these laws take place before the litigation does anything of value. So these are efforts. I mean, at the end of the day, they're financially targeted efforts, right? You're trying to disrupt the funding mechanism upon which all of these schools depend.
Right.
And it's a kind of a brilliant strategy that has, I think, a good chance of working.
How many other states do you think are likely to follow suit if it works?
Yeah, so this will initially be on a state-by-state basis, and those states that will follow will be the ones with the strongest anti-discrimination laws at the state level and the weakest religious freedom laws at the state level. So California is front and center in that mix, but there will be others to follow. The added challenge of California is there are so many CCCU schools in that state, and it's such a big state that there are a lot of institutions that are at risk right now.
So if Biola loses this case, it essentially means they're not eligible for any kind of student loans or grants, or what funding are they going to lose?
State funding only.
At the state level.
And how much state funding do they receive?
I don't know that.
Like, would the actual existence of the school be put in jeopardy, or would it just be an added financial burden to anybody who enrolled there?
I don't know that.
I don't know the bottom line of that question either, but we do, I think, have to think of all of this in the context of the crisis and the challenge on higher ed generally, where the margins are pretty slim as it is.
Right.
And, higher ed all across America is really hurting right now. And so when you take away some of the financial cookies that they've depended upon for a long time, it's going to be hard to move forward.
Do you think this could result in a number of CCCU schools abandoning their traditional definition of marriage?
Well, or just taking it out of the lifestyle commitment.
Right. That's abandoning it.
That'll be the temptation. They could say they still believe in it. They're just not requiring it to be upheld
and then
by their students.
It becomes a matter of Christian liberty.
It becomes a matter of fiscal responsibility to the trustees. I don't know. What do you think, John?
Well, I mean, it's interesting, right? When you think about what the Mormons had to do when they faced the polygamy challenges at the end of the 19th century, they changed their doctrine and criticized for it in some corners and were praised for it in other corners. And so I think each of the CCCU schools in the coming 5 to 10 years is going to have a sort of a soul-searching moment on these questions, and maybe they'll come up with creative solutions and maybe not. My guess is that there'll be a split, and some will go one direction and some will go another.
Okay, well, we'll have to keep our eye on that.
I think we will.
Don't you think?
Yeah.
New York, Illinois, other big states, are they similar in rules on the books, or is it less likely to happen in some of those states?
I think it's a pretty complicated question, depending on sort of the local political capital of some of these schools, Wheaton and Chicago and so forth. It's hard. I think it's hard to generalize. It's pretty clear, though, California is one of the least welcoming states to these kinds of issues.
Okay. Well, there you go. Okay, let's get to John. Just co-wrote an article with Tim Keller, who's one of my favorite pastors. How do you know Tim?
Just over the last couple of years, we've been in some conferences and meetings together, and have sort of slowly realized we've been thinking about similar things in similar ways.
Okay. And so you decided to co-write an article. It's called How Christians Can Bear Gospel Witness in an Anxious Age. It's in this month's Christianity Today. Thank you. How should Christians in the United States bear witness in an anxious age? You start out by understanding the context in which we live. First of all, anxious age, what do you mean?
Yeah, so we took the line from a book by Jody Bottom with the same title, An Anxious Age, and we meant it to describe kind of a widespread anxiety in American society right now. So with Christians and conservative believers, it's often about issues of sexuality and religious freedom. With other people, some Christian and some not, it's financial challenges and the global economy. It's questions about race and racial injustice, and then it's also just anxiety over physical threats and terrorism and those sorts of things, but collectively trying to tap into this idea that there's just a lot of fear and angst right now.
Right. And do you think the Brexit is another example of an anxious age?
Sure seems like it, doesn't it?
Everything does. It's like everything, someone's scared or mad about something, and they're pushing in new ways. You say that, and this was interesting. I thought this was really interesting. In 1941, one of the main social facts in America was that public norms were dictated by a distinctly American Protestant culture in the white middle class. As such, Protestant churches provided many Americans with a great part of their social identity. The teachings of these Protestant churches, for better and sometimes for worse, contributed to a largely monolithic way of thinking about religion and morality. By the middle of the 20th century, that way of thinking had even made room for some Catholic and Jewish influences, but for very little else. So you think part of what's happened is the breakdown of kind of a monolithic Protestant way of viewing the world.
That's part of it. And again, this is drawing from Bottom's thesis. I just think he happens to be right about it. And it's really, I mean, to be clear, this is not evangelicalism. This is the Protestant mainline, and it had a kind of consensus, especially in the middle class. And so when we think of middle class values and middle class institutions, the anchor for many of them was the Protestant mainline in colleges and churches and other institutions.
So as the Protestant mainline churches declined, there was a polarization that occurred where some Christians ended up in a more conservative evangelical kind of environment, and where'd the others go? Just assimilate into a secularism that was post-Christian?
I think that's part of the story, but it's just, I think more broadly, it's the cultural recognition that there were Protestant norms infused in some of our institutions and there was pushback against them. So take public education, right? Very Protestant for a lot of our history. In fact, much of the history of public education is the Protestants trying to screw over the Catholics in public schools, which is why we have so many private Catholic schools. But then when this sort of Protestant bias or assumption is rooted out, it's replaced with something else that has its own normativity to it. So these battles today we see about secularism in the public schools and these kinds of questions, it's not like there's some neutral point that we're now teaching. It's just that there's a new normal into the public norms.
Okay. So we're anxious. What are we supposed to do about it? How then shall we live?
Right. I mean, so that's kind of the point of the article, which is that especially as Christians, we ought to have the resources to face anxiety, not with fear, but with confidence and with hope. And not just to talk about it, but to show each other how to live that out in a way that models it to each other, but also models it to the world. And this is actually, I do a lot of talking to churches and ministry groups, and I'm always surprised by the reaction of anxiety, because it seems to me we ought to be starting with hope and confidence. And if we really believe this stuff, that in the midst of challenges, we ought to be kind of the shining lights, not the Debbie Downers.
Mm-hmm. So, okay, my experience has been when I'm talking to church leaders or Christian groups about this kind of topic, I'm increasingly not surprised, although I wish I still was, I'm not surprised anymore about how committed so many Christians are to being afraid and being anxious. They get a lot of sense of identity and even righteousness out of the sense that I'm terrified of what's going on in the world, and that just shows how committed I am to Christ. So how do you begin to get people to realize this is not a virtue? This is not something we should be proud of, that anxiety and fear is actually going to be a barrier to following the way of Christ in our culture?
Yeah, that's going to be the real challenge, isn't it? I mean, one of the things we can do is to remind each other what real fear and real persecution looks like. And it's not what's happening in California. It's what's happening with ISIS, right? And Christians being beheaded, or it's what's happened to the church kind of through the ages when martyrs have joyfully gone to the executioner for the sake of Christ. And so this is not to say we don't have serious challenges right now. We do. California is one of them. We need to take them seriously and respond in a sophisticated way, but we ought not to kind of pat ourselves too much on the back for the fear and oppression we're facing, when in fact the history of the church is a far greater witness to really joy in the midst of trial.
Right. Right. In that piece, you give 3 examples of engaging with our culture for the good of the culture, which is, you think we should do that? You think we should actually try to improve the culture?
It seems there's some good stuff in there about in the Bible about that stuff.
In areas of politics, race, and religious liberty, that we need to attend to the practical needs of our neighbors, and sometimes loving our neighbors means engaging in politics. So is that a different political posture than engaging in politics to protect our own interests?
That's a great leading question. I think it is, yes.
Softball.
I think that it's important that we bear witness by defending the other and standing up for the sake of the other. And that often is going to happen on a local level as well as a national level. I think one of the lessons I've really learned lately from especially millennials is that the distaste for kind of the national level power politics of the religious right, some of which we've seen, just in the last few days resurging.
Right.
It doesn't mean we have to give up on politics writ large, and that actually doing real political work and using things like law and government are actually really important, and they're places Christians ought to be. We just need to a different posture and a different game plan than the one we've had in the 80s and 90s.
Yeah. It seems like we're coming through a couple of decades of trying to use politics for the benefit of us, rather than using that. And when you look historically at Christian political activism, it was typically for the benefit of them. It was for the working poor. It was for child labor. It was for, even the prohibition movement was wealthier Christian women trying to protect poor women, from spousal abuse and from poverty because their husbands were in the saloons. So we have a great tradition of using politics for the benefit of others, which at some point we just kind of flipped it and said, no, wait a minute, now we're the oppressed minority.
Right. Well, on the other side, there's also another piece of the history, which is when Christians have had power and held it for their own interest, it often hasn't gone very well, right? They've used it to very bad ends, and they've been captivated by power. And that's also the narrative we've seen played out here in the United States in the last half of the 21st century.
So, John, give us an example of a contemporary issue that you feel like Christians could mobilize on in the public square and in politics that wouldn't be viewed as just self-interested.
Well, I've written a fair amount on the current challenges around racial justice and questions of police violence, but not just police violence, but our criminal justice system, housing and education, and these sorts of things. So there seems to be some low-hanging fruit where especially white evangelicals could engage with more than words, but actually putting their bodies out there and standing in solidarity and working toward change in ways that we really haven't seen yet. But that's going to mean maybe some risky partnerships. And sometimes when I'm in places and spaces with people who don't look just like us, there becomes that fear and anxiety that we'll somehow be corrupted, or people will misconstrue our symbolic actions and these sorts of things. And I think we just have to get past that and start taking more risks.
Right. Okay. Here's a harder question for you. Okay. So, okay, you believe we should fight for religious liberty for everybody, right? But if we've already established that part of what made America great was that Protestant tradition, couldn't you also argue that Protestant tradition should have a privileged position?
Good non-leading question. So I guess we'd have to think through a couple things. One of them is just the changed demographics we have in our country. So part of what made that Protestant tradition work is that we were at a time largely Protestant, and especially at the beginnings of our country, we were largely Protestant. And in some ways we benefited from that kind of homogeneity when we had people thinking and doing a lot of the same things. We're just in a far different place today. And so we need to think more carefully about what it means to privilege a set of views over another. And so an easy example here, I think, is prayer in public and official state prayer. There was a time pretty early on in our country when it just made sense that a prayer to God would not really offend anyone. And that's just not the case today, right? So you're going to pray at a public meeting in some locality in the United States, and some people there might not believe in God at all, and others will have very different beliefs. And so to insist on kind of a Protestant prayer or a prayer to God can be disruptive to a lot of people in ways that I don't think help us where we are today. Okay,
so we need to stand up for everybody, even if they don't hold firm to the kind of Protestant values that we think are fundamental to the American experiment?
Yes. Well, and because that's always been part of what's been built into our system. So I guess one thing to remember about the Protestants in the late 18th century is, yes, they were all largely Protestant, but yes, they also all hated each other, and sometimes they were even killing each other. So the differences today that are differences about how the church building looks might have been differences of life or death a couple hundred years ago. And they figured out a way to live with that kind of difference. And that's not all that different than what we're talking about today.
Okay. Well, I'm going to transition to your book, which is very much related to this. Is it out yet?
It is out.
Okay. John has a book, everybody. It's called Confident Pluralism from the University of Chicago Press. So it's on Amazon. It's everywhere.
It's everywhere.
Okay, go look it up. Confident pluralism.
Subtitle.
Subtitle, Surviving and Thriving Through Deep Difference. Is that even possible as our differences seem to be becoming deeper and deeper?
Yeah, that's the question on the table, right? And I don't know the answer to that. I hope it's possible. I just wrote a book trying to say that it's possible, but I also think it's an open-ended question. And part of the challenge is there are going to be super conservative people that don't want to engage with this idea of pluralism at all. They just want to say our way is the right way and everything else is scary relativism. And there'll be super progressive people that will basically give the mirror image of that argument and say they're not going to engage. So there are going to be people, and a lot of people, who don't want to listen to this argument. But I'm hopeful that there are enough people who are still wanting to figure out how we move forward together. And that's kind of the gamble of the book.
You could work on your salesman tactics a little bit better, John, because to say that you're not sure if this can work is not the best way to really promote the book. But the subtitle, it caught my attention because you have surviving and thriving. I think some people feel like, I just want to survive.
Best case scenario.
Yeah,
we survive this.
Right, keep our head above the water. But apparently you're arguing that no, you can actually thrive, that there's a flourishing that's possible in a pluralistic society, that a vision for that, I would be on your side, absolutely. But I think the vision for that is increasingly hard for people to believe in, especially when we have people like Trump who are saying, in so many words, pluralism doesn't work. It's a sham. We need to go back to make America great again, not move forward. So in your mind, what is the difference between just surviving and thriving? What does a thriving pluralistic society look like?
Well, right. So, I mean, the first point, which you just mentioned, is, I guess, to double down on my pessimism here for a minute. If we are going to move forward, if this does have a chance, we've got to get past kind of this mentality of going back, right? Or winning back some kind of America that probably never existed except in people's minds, but that is going to do great harm to many of our neighbors today if we move in that direction. So we've got to get past that. But then the question is, can you actually thrive rather than just survive? And I think the answer is yes, in a limited kind of way. So I think that I hear a lot of Christians talk about the common good of America or of this country. And it's not clear to me that we have a common good that we can all identify and name together anymore. And maybe we never did. But we can still, I think, find places of common ground and maybe many places of flourishing. And we can figure out ways to help each other and really work through friendships. So part of what I try to do in the book is to say, we can be friends even in the face of fierce disagreements. And we can prove this by living it out. And we can tell each other stories and model these kinds of friendships. We're just not doing it very well. We don't do it well in social media. We don't do it well in our sort of segregated and bifurcated neighborhoods. But I think kind of human nature is to connect and treat people as people. And so there's the hope.
Right. For Christians, what's even the context for that to happen, though? If we've all moved out to the suburbs and we're hanging out with our other Christian friends and we're on Facebook with our other Christian friends, where are we even? What's the context to bump into other than really nasty message boards? How do you do this? How do you interact with people that have radically different views than yourself? And how do you not lose your views while trying to bend over to be nice?
Right. Yes. My friend Ann Snyder was just commenting on my book and pointed out that I think helpfully that we could think of maybe our social and relational networks in terms of rings. And we all have an inner ring of friendships and maybe a middle ring and an outer ring. And it's very important for Christians to have and sustain that inner ring. And we need to have churches that are not just kind of churches and trendy bars and coffee shops, but churches that actually do church and sustain our core beliefs and reinforce what we believe. But then after that, we can take some risks and move out. And so you're right. I mean, if we're all living in the suburbs and just going to church things, that's not going to happen. So we have to work in creative ways to find other. I mean, the workplace is a great place for many people to find others who don't agree with them. The university is a great place. The public square, when they still exist, is a great place. And then I think the social media fix is even easier if we would just do it. And that's to say, get out of our bubbles and, kind of complicate our Facebook and Twitter feeds with people we don't usually agree with and try to have some of our own ideas challenged a bit.
Are we up against a evangelical subculture, though, that has so emphasized the value of safety that taking risks it doesn't fit with our popular theology anymore? The only time I ever hear the church really talk about engaging non-believers or people who think differently, it's for the sake of mission. It's for the sake of evangelizing them or winning them to our side. It's rarely talked about as a way of just living life in a pluralistic culture. In that regard, it's you keep your family safe, take them out of the public school, take them out of public radio, take them out of public square, take them out of public everything, and keep them in this little safe enclave because that's the only way to protect them. So even the rhetoric in our subculture is against this thriving in a pluralistic society. So do we have to change the way we're talking first in order to equip people to go out there?
We might, and part of it, I think, is to lessen this divide between the pluralistic society on the one hand and the missional society on the other hand, right? And to realize that actually the pluralistic society is the missional society. And here, someone like the theologian Leslie Newbigin becomes really important, and we need to be reading people who have been missionaries and then who have come back to a Western context and said, hey, wait a minute, this is how we think about culture in an engaging way that we would just on the mission field as well.
Right. Have you been able to build good friendships with people that think your beliefs are insane?
I have, insofar as I think that's a lot of my colleagues at where I teach, right? My going into position to my job was I wanted to work on winning friendships before winning arguments. And as a lot of professors, we're great at arguing, but we're people too, and we need to work on friendships. And I feel like I've got really good and meaningful friendships with people who disagree quite vehemently with most of what I think and believe and care about.
Okay. What is confident pluralism as opposed to just plain old pluralism?
Plain old pluralism.
Or unconfident pluralism?
Well, I think an unconfident pluralism is the kind of pluralism that really is just relativism. It's the kind of pluralism that says anything goes, you say tomato, I say tomato, it's all relative. And that's not really anything that's compatible with Christian theology. And a kind of pluralism that says we actually have real and meaningful differences that are not going to be overcome and that actually matter quite a bit. And we'll work maybe for the rest of our lives to persuade each other about the rightness of our beliefs and the wrongness of other people's beliefs. But that it's sort of a thick difference that requires relationship and coexistence. And then the confidence part of it is that we're confident enough in our own beliefs to engage in that. And so this is another place where I think Christians can really lead by example here. If we're confident enough in the message of the gospel to orient our lives around it and to teach our kids to believe in it, then can we not also be confident enough to engage with others who disagree with us?
So it sounds a little bit like the way Os Guinness uses the term convicted civility. I don't think he's the only one who uses that term, but to be civil with a diverse community, but still be with conviction around your own beliefs.
Right. So we're not, because I've had actually through the podcast a number of interactions with very strong atheists, that typically you'd say, all right, well, we're going to butt heads and then someone's going to be declared the winner out of this interaction. And rather than trying to do that, I completely set that aside, and so did they. And we just said, okay, well, let's just talk. What's it like to, one of them, what's it like to be an atheist living in Mississippi? What's it like to go up against Christians who think you're crazy? And once you do that, there's such a disarming, sense to it that you realize, oh, I'm dealing with a person, not an ideology that's out to get my ideology. And they make the same realization.
Uh-oh.
Oh, come on. Who's that?
That's my wife.
Oh, no. It's time for your wife to call, John. So part of the, but then, I also have people saying, hey, you never really pressed him on his beliefs.
Right.
You never really stuck it to him for why do you believe what you believe? can we, how do you go about dealing with your peers in making sure you're being true to your convictions, but at the same time valuing the person more than the conviction?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I think it depends on recognizing sort of the counsel about having many parts of the body and many roles that we're supposed to fill. And so there might be some people who are only called to be in relationship with other people and to find those areas of common ground, and others who might be called very clearly to name difference and to name moral failures and to name the consequences of different beliefs. And we don't all have to be doing that at once. And so this reminds me, a couple of the comments I saw in response to the article that Keller and I wrote were things like, you should have made this more gospel oriented, or why wasn't there more Jesus in this article? And I want to kind of say to those kinds of comments, there's not every article has to be a sermon or a gospel message, right? Mm-hmm. And not every encounter with another person has to be the 4 spiritual laws, that there are lots of ways to engage with people. And I think that Jesus did this too. There are lots of times to speak and not to speak, and to read different situations.
Okay, so here's my question.
Ooh, this is the big one. The one you've been saving.
Maybe.
Okay.
Maybe.
Okay, get ready.
We've been talking about the importance for us as believers to be confident in our faith and to reach out and engage winfully a pluralistic community and make friends and all. That's great. Fine. Let's say we've solved that problem. There is this other side.
I don't think we've solved that
Well, let's just pretend we have.
We agree on it.
John's book has solved the problem completely. But there's another side to this, and that is we are increasingly in a culture, I see this particularly among millennials, that view confidence in another person as aggression. We talk about microaggressions. We talk about if you have convictions, well, then you're not making any room for me to have like you can have, Phil, you can have a meaningful engagement with another atheist, not that you're an atheist, but another atheist, because that atheist has confidence in their belief. You have confidence in your belief, and there's a safety created.
And we respect that about each other.
That's right.
That we're playing the same game with the same rules.
A little bit. And I've had that engagement with Muslims, for example. Yeah. And it's really healthy and it's good. But when you have confidence in what you believe, but you're up against, or you're engaging with people who are incredibly, how do I put it, thin-skinned, who have no conviction of their own, who view everything as a threat, who see anybody of conviction as being aggressive, it's really hard to go into the public square with conviction when you're being accused of basically abusing people when you don't intend to. Does this make sense, John?
Oh, this makes total sense.
Okay.
It's a striking problem, especially in the university setting right now. And it's this sense of people not just wanting to be tolerated, but wanting to be fully embraced and accepted. Anything short of acceptance becomes hate or a rejection of a person's dignity. And these kinds of arguments, and I think that we can't possibly coexist if that's really the end game. If it's because we actually can't. I think just as a logical matter, we can't all fully embrace one another, right? And we're always if we're going to acknowledge that we have meaningful differences, then we're going to have to allow for those differences to exist. So your question is a hugely important one, and we need. I think especially on the college campus right now, we need more people to weigh in against these kinds of arguments that demand full acceptance and not just toleration.
And that my biggest unknown here is I feel like, again, and we can work on the Christian community side and get people to be confident and engage their pluralistic culture, but we can't be the ones telling non-Christians, hey, you need to grow a thicker skin, because it's just not come off well. It needs to be the secular liberals who are policing their own side to say we can't expect everyone to fully embrace everything we believe in, and we can't call those who don't fully embrace us bigots or hate mongers or whatever. But that's a whole side of the culture that we have no influence over and no power over. So I feel really kind of disempowered. Is that the right word?
Sure.
Like, what do there's just nothing we can do there. We can clean up our house, but everyone else's house is a mess.
So what do you do with hypersensitive students in your world? Do you go out of your way to try not to push their buttons, or do you just respond the way you think a mature person should, and then let the chips fall where they may?
Yeah, I mean, I try to press them on their priors and on the areas that are going to make them uncomfortable. That's core to I think what teachers are supposed to do. So I teach, for example, I teach criminal law, and we talk about hard things in criminal law like rape and sexual assault and racial profiling and police brutality. And you can't talk about those issues without stepping on some toes. And so you try to do that in a way that respects people, but challenges ideas and presuppositions. And I think that's kind of what we've been doing in higher ed for a long time, and we need to keep doing it. I think it's really important. And then, Skye, to your point about how do we make the argument to others, we need to, and I wrote this book. This book is not a Christian book. It doesn't start with, this is why Jesus says to be tolerant of other people. It's a book that's rooted in American constitutional history and thought, and it's an argument that I hope is persuadable and approachable by the 25-year-old who doesn't believe much of anything or who doesn't have any exposure to faith commitments or anything like that. And there are a lot of those people out there who I think are also still willing to listen to arguments and conversation and who actually want a different way forward. They want to coexist as much as we do. So I think not giving up on those people, but also more people and more Christians who are able and willing to make arguments that don't surround themselves in Christianese and Christian presuppositions.
Right. Is it okay to say hell in your argument?
Yes.
But in a pluralistic society, hell won't be occupied by anyone.
That's right.
Yeah.
And there probably isn't a hell in the pluralistic society.
No, that's more relativistic.
Where do bad people go in a relativistic society?
To Cleveland. I'm joking.
LeBron James, a bad person?
I was a little disappointed with the outcome of that.
I was happy for Cleveland. You think Cleveland didn't need a boost more than Silicon Valley needed a boost?
I just would have been a little happier if Cleveland got that boost from the Browns rather than the Cavs.
Hey.
Just saying.
Beggars can't be choosers, dude. I mean, sheesh. Okay. John, do you have one parting piece of advice for Christians who actually want to try to make a difference? What's a good way to start?
Buy his book.
Buy my book. Great. Thank you, Scott. I think start with something practical and attainable, like mixing up your social media feeds or working toward one friend who's not like you. That's kind of a slow start, but it would actually make a difference.
How many days do you get before they need to come to Jesus or you need to move on to another friend?
Have a little flexibility with that one.
All right. Okay, I'm going to wrap this up with a little song. John Inazu has a thing to say to you, so he wrote a little book. I think you should take a look. His pluralism is confident. I think we should make him president, and then he won't be a crook. If we can all then make everyone read his book, we can get along a little bit better. If pluralism is our sweater, and then Biola can keep having students come and not go out of business and have to send everyone to UCLA. All right. Thanks, John, for being on the show. Hi, John's daughter. How are you? Thanks.
And she's gone.
Thanks for watching. The book is Confident Pluralism by John Inazu. You can find it on Amazon and everywhere else John's books are sold. And we remember to go to Patreon and support the podcast. And we will see you next week. Bye.
The Phil Fisher Podcast is produced by Phil Fisher Enterprises and recorded live at Jellyfish Lab Studios. This episode was edited by Jason Rugg and was fact-checked by absolutely no one. For more information, go to philfisher.com.